In March 1887, the iron bark Derry Castle was nearing the end of a long voyage. Built in 1877 in Glasgow, she was a full-rigged sailing vessel of more than 1,000 tons, owned by the Shaw, Saville and Albion Company. Like many ships of her era, she carried cargo and crew along established trade routes between Britain and New Zealand. On this voyage, she had departed from Geelong, Australia, bound for Falmouth in England. Her cargo consisted primarily of wool, tightly packed into her holds. The route would take her eastward across the Southern Ocean, rounding the southern tip of New Zealand before turning north into the Tasman Sea and beyond. The captain, William Thorne, commanded a crew of approximately 23 officers and sailors. They were working seamen accustomed to long passages and the discipline of sail. Life aboard such a vessel followed a strict routine. Watches rotated through the day and night. Maintenance of rigging and hull was constant. Navigation relied on sextant readings, chronometers, and dead reckoning. Weather forecasts, as understood today, did not exist. Experience and observation guided decisions. The Southern Ocean was known for strong winds and shifting weather systems. Sailing vessels often rode powerful westerlies across these latitudes, sometimes covering great distances quickly. At the same time, heavy seas and sudden fog could complicate navigation. The coastline of the Auckland Islands was particularly hazardous. Charts existed, but accuracy depended on interpretation and careful estimation of position. As the Derry Castle approached the waters south of New Zealand in late March, there is no evidence of panic or unusual alarm aboard. The voyage had been long but routine. The crew expected to clear the region and continue toward England. The Auckland Islands were not intended as a destination. They were simply land to be avoided. On the night of March 20, 1887, the ship was sailing in reduced visibility. Contemporary reports suggest fog or darkness limited clear sight of land. Whether through navigational miscalculation or unrecognized drift, the vessel found herself closer to the Auckland Islands than intended. In the 19th century, small errors in longitude or current estimation could accumulate gradually. Without modern instruments, ships depended on celestial observations that required clear skies. When visibility failed, so did precise confirmation of position. The Derry Castle was operating within that narrow margin common to ocean navigation of the time. A few miles of uncertainty in open sea rarely mattered. Near an unlit, rocky coastline, they could prove decisive. By the evening of March 20, the bark was sailing on a course that would bring her dangerously near Enderby Island. The crew did not yet understand how near they were. Routine continued. Watches were maintained. The wind carried the vessel forward. What followed would shift the voyage from trade passage to survival. Within hours, the ship that had crossed oceans would no longer be under command. The Auckland Islands, distant and seldom visited, were about to become the center of the cruise world. Shortly before midnight on March 20, 1887, the Derry Castle struck land. In darkness and reduced visibility, the iron hull ran onto the rocky coast of Enderby Island. The impact was sudden. Accounts recorded later indicate that the ship grounded heavily, the force of the collision damaging the structure beyond recovery. The sea continued to move against the vessel. Swells pressed her onto the rocks. Once grounded in such conditions, a sailing ship had limited options. There were no engines to reverse clear. Efforts to free her would have depended on tide, wind, and intact hull strength. In this case, the damage was decisive. Water began entering the ship. In darkness and confusion, the crew attempted to respond. Contemporary records confirmed that lifeboats were launched. The shoreline was close, but the surf was active and the rocks uneven. Several men attempted to reach land through the water. Not all succeeded. Of the approximately 23 men aboard, 8 reached shore alive. The others were lost in the attempt to escape the wreck. Their deaths occurred in the initial chaos of abandonment and surf, before any prolonged isolation began. By morning, the Derry Castle lay broken against the rocks. The surviving 8 men stood on Enderby Island without shelter and with only what they had managed to bring ashore. Some wreckage washed onto the beach in the following hours. Much of the ship's stores remained inaccessible within the damaged hull. The transition from voyage to survival was immediate. There was no gradual decline, no warning that could be acted upon. One moment they were crew aboard a transoceanic bark. The next, they were castaways on a remote island in the Southern Ocean. The Auckland Islands were uninhabited. No permanent settlement existed nearby. Passing ships were infrequent. The men could not assume rescue would arrive quickly. By dawn on March 21, 1887, 8 survivors of the Derry Castle faced an uncertain period on Enderby Island. The wreck behind them marked the end of their voyage. The months ahead would determine who remained alive. Morning light revealed the coastline in full. The wreck of the Derry Castle lay fixed against the rocks, her iron hull angled and partially flooded. Debris moved in the surf. Sections of timber, cargo fragments, and loose fittings drifted toward shore with each wave. For the 8 men who had survived the night, the wreck was no longer transport. It was a source of materials. Their first concern was exposure. Enderby Island offered no immediate shelter. Wind moved across open ground without obstruction. The survivors were wet from the surf and from hours spent in the cold night air. Without protection, further loss of life would follow quickly. Salvage operations began at once. Reaching the wreck itself was dangerous. The hull remained unstable, and the sea continued to press against it. However, floating debris provided opportunity. Planks, spars, and fragments of decking were carried ashore by the tide. The men gathered what they could safely retrieve from the beach. Some supplies were also recovered from accessible parts of the wreck before it deteriorated further. Contemporary accounts suggest that a limited quantity of food was obtained, though far less than the full cargo would have allowed under safer conditions. Much of the wool shipment remained trapped within the holds and offered no immediate use. The survivors moved inland from the surf line to find ground slightly elevated above the reach of waves. Enderby Island's terrain consisted of peat soil and thick tussock grass. There were no tall trees suitable for construction. Any structure would need to rely on wreckage and natural contours in the land. Using salvaged timbers and pieces of sailcloth, the men constructed a temporary shelter. The structure was simple. Low walls were braced against wind. Sections of sail were stretched overhead to provide some barrier against rain. Earth and turf were added along the base to reduce drafts. The shelter was not permanent in design, but it reduced immediate exposure. Clothing was dried where possible. Fire posed a difficulty. Driftwood was scarce, and much wreckage was saturated. In time, they succeeded in igniting small fires using materials kept dry within salvaged containers. Warmth remained limited and fuel would need careful conservation. Fresh water was located inland in natural streams. Enderby Island possessed small freshwater sources fed by rainfall. Access to water was not the primary concern. Food, shelter strength, and the uncertainty of rescue were more pressing. By the end of the first days, the men had established a rudimentary camp above the shoreline. The wreck continued to break apart under repeated wave action. Each tide altered its structure, reducing further opportunity for recovery. The transition from immediate survival to sustained endurance had begun. 8 men remained alive. They had shelter of a kind. They had limited provisions. The Southern Ocean remained unchanged around them. What they did next would determine how long those resources would last. Once immediate shelter had been secured, the men turned to the problem of duration. Enderby Island offered no guarantee of quick discovery. The Auckland Islands lay outside regular shipping lanes, and passing vessels were rare. The survivors could not assume rescue within days or weeks. The limited provisions salvaged from the wreck were inventoried and divided. Maritime discipline remained present even without a functioning ship. Rations were measured carefully. No formal log of their exact quantities survives, but contemporary reports confirmed that food was scarce from the beginning. The cargo of wool provided no nourishment. What mattered were small amounts of flour, preserved goods, and anything else brought ashore during the chaotic hours after grounding. Very quickly, natural resources became essential. Enderby Island supported populations of seals along its coast. In the 19th century, sealing had already reduced numbers in many regions, but animals still hauled out on the rocks of the Auckland Islands. The men hunted them using improvised weapons and physical force. Seal meat became the primary source of protein. Blubber provided calories and, in some cases, fuel. Processing the animals required effort and coordination. Carcasses were cut and portions dried when possible. The damp climate complicated preservation. Fires were maintained carefully to conserve fuel. The island lacked tall timber, driftwood and salvaged planks remained the principal sources of burning material. Fresh water continued to be obtained from streams inland. Rain was frequent, and the men used containers to collect runoff where practical. Water was not abundant in comfort, but it was available in sufficient quantity. Routine developed gradually. Each day required tasks. Some gathered fuel. Others searched for additional wreckage washed ashore by shifting tides. Hunting parties moved toward the coastline when weather allowed. The shelter required reinforcement against wind and rain. Repairs were constant. The climate rarely allowed full dryness. Clothing remained damp. Exposure to wind on open ground accelerated fatigue. The men had arrived with maritime clothing suitable for ocean passage, but not for extended residence on a subantarctic island. Time began to lose clear structure. Without fixed dates beyond memory, days blended into one another. The men likely marked time in approximate counts, though no personal diaries survived to confirm their method. The certainty was not the date, but the condition. Isolation continued. Cooperation remained essential. Historical accounts of the Derry Castle survivors do not describe early conflict among the 8 men. Instead, they appear to have maintained shared effort in maintaining camp and gathering food. Discipline that had governed shipboard life translated into structured survival. Weather dictated activity. Storms confined them to shelter. Clear intervals allowed hunting and salvage. Each cycle repeated with little variation. The first weeks passed under this pattern. The shelter stood. Food, though limited, was secured daily. Rescue had not yet appeared on the horizon. The men had moved beyond immediate crisis. They were now engaged in sustained endurance. As weeks extended into months, Enderby Island became less a temporary refuge and more a fixed reality. The wreck of the Derry Castle had by then broken apart beyond further use. Only scattered fragments remained along the shoreline. The ship that had carried them across oceans was no longer visible in recognizable form. The men continued to rely on seal meat as their principal food source. Hunting remained physically demanding. Seals were strong and required close contact to dispatch. Each hunt exposed the men to wind and surf. Success provided nourishment. Failure meant hunger. Firewood grew increasingly scarce. Salvaged timbers were limited, and driftwood did not replenish quickly. Small fires were maintained rather than large ones. Warmth inside the shelter was uneven. Smoke accumulated beneath the low roof when ventilation was restricted to conserve heat. Clothing deteriorated under constant dampness. There were no spare garments beyond what had been saved from the wreck. Repairs were made with improvised stitching using cordage from the ship. Wet wool, when repeatedly dried and re-wetted, stiffened and thinned. Protection against wind decreased over time. The psychological effect of isolation was less visible but no less significant. The Auckland Islands were uninhabited. No smoke from other camps appeared on the horizon. No signal of passing ships interrupted the horizon. The men were aware that few vessels traveled near these waters, and fewer still would deliberately approach such coasts. Time lengthened without clear measure. Seasonal change offered limited relief. The subantarctic climate did not provide dramatic shifts. Rain, wind, and overcast skies remained constant features. Grasslands moved in the wind as they had on the first day. The survivors maintained routine to counter uncertainty. Shelter was inspected regularly. Drainage channels were cleared to prevent flooding during heavy rain. Seal hunts were organized methodically. Small improvements were made to their camp as materials allowed. Physical condition gradually altered. A diet based largely on seal meat provided calories but lacked variety. Fresh plant matter was limited. Energy expenditure during hunting and fuel gathering remained high. Weight loss and fatigue became evident. There were no confirmed records of precise dates marking each stage of their confinement. However, it is known that the men remained on Enderby Island for approximately 120 days. During that period, no rescue vessel arrived. Communication with the outside world was non-existent. The men had no means to signal distant ships beyond fires or visible movement. In poor weather, even these signals would have gone unnoticed. As the fourth month approached, the camp remained functional but strained. Resources had not yet failed completely, but they were reduced. The shelter had endured repeated storms. Food was still obtained, though with effort. Isolation had become their defining condition. The Southern Ocean continued without reference to their presence. The island offered what it had from the beginning: land, water, seals, wind. The outcome of their endurance would depend not only on effort, but on time. By the later stages of their confinement, the strain on the 8 survivors had become visible. Months of damp exposure and restricted diet began to affect physical strength. Seal meat continued to sustain them, but it did not restore lost condition. The work required to obtain food grew heavier as energy declined. Cold and moisture remained constant. Even without extreme freezing temperatures, the subantarctic climate drained endurance. Wind removed warmth quickly from exposed skin. Rain saturated clothing. The shelter, reinforced repeatedly, still admitted drafts during storms. Historical records indicate that not all of the 8 men survived the full 120 days. During the isolation, 3 of the survivors died. Their deaths are generally attributed to the cumulative effects of exposure, malnutrition, and physical exhaustion. Precise medical descriptions are limited in surviving accounts, but the pattern is consistent with prolonged hardship in a cold maritime environment. Burial on Enderby Island required effort. The peat soil could be dug, though conditions were often wet and unstable. The remaining men interred their dead near the camp. There were no markers beyond what could be fashioned from simple materials. The island retained those graves long after the survivors departed. With each loss, the burden on the remaining men increased. Fewer hands meant longer hours for hunting and maintenance. Physical weakness and psychological strain moved together. Yet no records suggest internal violence or disorder among them. Their survival depended on cooperation, and it appears that cooperation continued despite declining strength. Uncertainty became constant. There was no sign of passing ships. Smoke signals produced no response. The men could not know whether months more lay ahead or whether rescue might appear at any moment. Weather continued its steady cycle. Rain swept across the grasslands. Surf broke along the same stretch of coast where the Derry castle had grounded. The island did not change in response to their suffering. By the end of approximately 4 months, 5 men remained alive. They were weakened but still capable of movement and work. Their shelter stood. Seal hunting, though difficult, had not ceased entirely. Isolation had taken lives. It had altered those who remained. Survival was no longer measured in days but in persistence.